Unit 13. Unit 13. Global Dominance Before 9/11. Unit 13. Global Dominance Before 9/11, 1992 to 2001. So here we're going to look at the world of the 1990s. Both the world at large and, of course, then the United States. In terms of the world at large, there's some general kinds of things that really become really apparent at this time. First of all, of course, the most significant of all was the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism. And, of course, that had initially an enormous negative economic effect in the Soviet Union because, the communism had been a welfare system, and many low-income, elderly Russians, especially who lived on fixed incomes and pensions, suffered a great deal. On the other hand, the intellectuals, educated people, people with college degrees, younger people, benefited a lot and took advantage of all kinds of economic opportunities to advance their careers and especially to engage in business investment. So a number of entrepreneurs got extremely rich. They often used methods that were illegal and even resorted to violence. So in addition to the corruption that existed and that was pervasive throughout the Soviet system, there was also a rise in organized crime and also individual violence, but especially in criminal gangs and various kinds of activity, and repression of freedom of speech, repression of civil liberties was not, continued even in the free enterprise system that Russia was following. Many of the former leaders in Soviet Russia continued to be influential. For example, Vladimir Putin had been a KGB officer under the Soviets, and he rose to power as a politician and as a protege of Boris Yeltsin. Within the rest of the world, this is increasingly, the technology increased globalization, and globalization meant different things to different people. On the one hand, globalization could mean greater emergence of world culture, cultural exchanges, the internet, satellite communications, jet travel brought people together to share their common experiences. It also encouraged what was called the rise of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, which were also called often INGOs, international non-governmental organizations. And these were agencies that had particular promotions of rights. Some of them were focused on health issues. Some of them were focused on freedom of speech and personal liberty issues. Some of them were focused on the rights of women and children. And the two most well-known, probably, single organizations were Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. But there was also Doctors Without Borders, CARE, Cause Canada, Save the Children. All these international organizations worked to alleviate poverty and suffering, to promote human rights, to promote freedom of expression, and so forth. And they came to have very powerful influences on the behavior of governments. In addition to that, of course, there was a negative international kind of organization, and that was international terrorism, particularly Islamic-based extremism, which came out of the Middle East. Initially, it grew out of the Afghan war, but by the 1990s it spread, and these were people who were convinced that the United States was the great Satan. Now, in terms of who was financing terrorism, there were a number of Islamic sources that came from Islamic majority countries. There was evidence that the Libyan government under Muammar Gaddafi was funding terrorism. there was evidence that the Iranian government, under the Ayatollahs, was funding terrorism. There was also the evidence that in Saudi Arabia, there was funding of terrorism, not only from Osama bin Laden, but the various other religious groups within Saudi Arabia were supporting terrorism. But that Saudi-supported terrorism didn't get as much attention because Saudi Arabia was an ally of the United States, whereas the two countries that were really had the finger pointed at them as terrorism, well, there were three. Of course, Iraq, Iran, and Libya were the primary countries accused of funding terrorism. Although it was Middle Easterners who were primary victims just in terms of loss of life, there were two primary terrorist activities against the United States. One was the blowing up of Marine barracks in Lebanon, and the other was the blowing up of the ship Cole in the Mediterranean. Both of these acts were committed by Middle Eastern terrorists against Americans. We'll talk about terrorism a little later on and what they stood for, what they thought they were trying to do, but it became a major international force. Now, also in the world, there were two major human rights violations, genocidal violations. One was in Africa, and the second was in the Balkan Peninsula in Europe. In Africa, in Rwanda, the conflict was between the Tutsis and the Hutus, and this is described in the reading and in your textbook. These ethnic differences, we call them tribal differences, but tribe is often only applied to black Africans, and many of these groups were ethnic groups or nations just like in Europe, and we don't call the white Europeans tribes, but we reserve that term for Africans. So I'm going to avoid that term because it has considered to be racially charged. So instead of tribe, we're going to call these groups ethnic groups. So the Hutus were one large ethnic group and the Tutsis were another. Now historically, before the advent of colonialism, the Tutsis had been the overlords over the Tutus. When the Belgians colonized Rwanda, in order to divide the Africans against themselves, they encouraged the Tutsis to consider themselves a superior race of people, and they even issued ID cards that reinforced the ethnic separations and consciousness. So they deliberately encouraged the Hutus and the Tutsis to hate each other. And when Rwanda became an independent country, that hatred simply was intensified. And so Rwanda was never a unified nation. Even today, it still has problems. So in 1992, in the spring and summer, there was this horrific genocidal outbreak that eventually resulted in the deaths of about 800,000 people, and the international community did nothing. The United States, in fact, blocked, under the Carter administration, the United States blocked action by the Security Council. The other center of genocidal violence was in the former Yugoslavia. And there, the major perpetrator of violence was the Serbs. And the major victims were Bosnians, mostly Muslims who lived in Bosnia and Serbia, or Serbian Bosnia, whatever you want to call it. They sort of lived side by side, but then they started attacking each other. The other was Kosovo, and the Kosovars also were victims of Serbian violence. And on two occasions, after the Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia, the United States bombed Serbians' installations to make them stop, and then later, after in Kosovo, the United States bombed the Serbians, and in both cases, Serbs were forced to stop, and then the United States tried to broker a peace accord in Dayton, Ohio. But whereas the NGOs were international efforts to help women and children and poor people and victims, they were totally powerless to stop the violence in either Africa or in the Balkans. There were war crimes trials after it was over, where war criminals from Africa and from the Balkan Peninsula were tried and imprisoned, but the international criminal courts that were organized at that time were unable to prevent any kind of ethnic violence. So this is a time when the United States is really very prosperous economically and has a great deal of confidence. So in the year 2000, in the millennium, the United States felt that it was facing the 21st century with confidence and pride. Most Americans really didn't pay much attention. They didn't feel threatened by things in the world. They really didn't feel threatened even by the first initial terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. It killed 6 people and injured several hundred, but people weren't afraid. There was no sense of fear and threats from any kind of external source. People were happy and confident and really ignoring the world affairs. So that was the world of the 1990s.